I was headed to Orlando on a business trip about 2 years ago. When my family dropped me off at the airport, my middle child, Colin, on the left, hopped out of the car, grabbed my suitcase, and rolled it over to me so we could say goodbye. Colin was headed back to college the next day, and we knew we wouldn't see each other until he came home again for Thanksgiving in a couple of weeks. We stood at passenger drop-off, and I held him for the longest time because my mom taught me that the mom never breaks the hug first. I told him I loved him and that I couldn't wait to see him again at Thanksgiving. A few days after I returned from that trip, I was sound asleep in my bed, and I heard a knock at the door. I answered, and there were 2 police officers and a third man in plain clothing. When I learned he was the chaplain, I knew exactly what was going on. 2 of my 5 children were upstairs, sound asleep, but 3 of them lived away from home. I immediately asked, "Which one of my children is it?" They insisted I get my husband, and when I did, they stepped in the house and began reciting the worst words any parent could ever have to hear. On behalf of the Dublin Police Department, we regret to inform you that at 3 a.m. this morning, your son, Colin Wiant, was found unresponsive at 45 Mill Street in Athens, Ohio. We knew that address immediately. We knew it was the address of Colin's fraternity house, and that's all we knew. In the months that followed, we began to learn more about the details that led to Colin's death. And we learned that for the last weeks of Colin's life, Colin was beaten, belted, waterboarded, forced drugs. Colin was hazed. I set out to learn about hazing. I was in a sorority in college, and my husband was in a fraternity, but neither of us had ever experienced any hazing. So I started reading about hazing and studying about hazing. Before I knew it, I was teaching about hazing to thousands of students at universities across the country. And I was going to Capitol Hill to lobby for anti-hazing reform with my daughter and other parents who've lost a child to hazing. And I was drafting Ohio's anti-hazing and anti-bullying bill called Colin's Law. I was thrown into this whole new world of things that were completely unfamiliar to me just months prior. And I learned that hazing affects people we would never think of. When we look at groups in college that haze, number 1 on the list is varsity athletics. It's also prevalent in performing arts and marching bands and honor societies. In high school, it's in sports, music, theater, and church groups. Hazing's not just in the United States. There are hazing deaths across the globe. We don't realize its widespread nature because the only time we hear about hazing is when there's a death and it makes the news. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. What you're not seeing are all the kids who are traumatized by hazing in different ways. The 1.5 million high school students who are hazed every year. The 55% of college students in clubs, teams, and organizations who are hazed and don't report it. Hazing's only reported 5% of the time. If you think that's surprising, think about how often bullying goes unreported in our schools, or sexual harassment or discrimination at both work and school. So, who are these kids who are being hazed and don't report it? When we hear a story in the news about a hazing death, we immediately think of how horribly sad and tragic that is. But if you're like I was, there's something else you may be thinking, something you wouldn't dare say to me, that the truth is these are the kids with low self-esteem, no backbone. They're weak, they're needy, they can't stand up for themselves. Otherwise, they would have walked away. You'd say all the things I would have said before my own son died from hazing. Since then, I've learned a lot. See, if you ask people who knew Colin, you would hear that he was strong, both physically and mentally. He was an athlete, He was smart. He was a leader. He was pledge class president. He was independent, so much so that ever since he was little, it was the running joke of our family that he always marched to the beat of a different drummer without a care of what anyone else was doing. You would hear that he stood up for himself, and one of his most defining qualities, that he always stood up for others. A few days after Colin died, when our family gathered around the kitchen island to write his obituary, the first thing my kids said had to be in it was that Colin always stood up for the underdog. Each year, people we would never expect die from hazing, from Boy Scouts to football players, from student nurses to scholars at MIT. Recently, a Green Beret soldier died in a chokehold from hazing. When I think of a Green Beret soldier, I think of the epitome of strength and courage. I don't think of someone who's weak or needy or trying to fit in. I don't think of someone who's susceptible to fall prey to hazing. Yet, no matter how strong we are, each of us has a huge need to belong. For thousands of years, we relied on belonging for our survival. Whether we were building shelter or hunting for food, our survival rate was higher if we were part of a group than if we were alone. Studies show that the social pain we feel when we're rejected creates a response in our neural processing like the response caused from physical pain. We literally feel pain when we're deprived of social connection. Our brains are hardwired to belong. So we're accustomed to doing things to belong. That's used in hazing in a way that's a very slow build. It has to be, or it wouldn't work, right? I mean, think about it. Imagine that you're a freshman in college and you're considering joining a fraternity. So you attend the campus event where prospective members meet fraternity members. You start chatting with a few people from one of the fraternities and think, they're pretty cool, maybe I'll come back to the next event. And just as you're leaving, one of them stops you and says, oh, hey, wait a minute, by the way, I'm gonna need you to do my laundry tonight and run errands for me all week. I'll need you to make my meals. I'm going to tie you up, scream at you, throw things at you, make you eat disgusting items, and after that, we're going to be great friends. If it actually went like that, people would walk away. So how are these kids going from meeting a total stranger to months later letting that stranger tie them up in a basement? It's something called creeping normality. That's when objectionable change is accepted if it occurs in small increments. Hazing starts with something that seems to be a small, harmless act, something that's completely benign, no danger associated with it, like having to carry brick with you everywhere you go. Then you're having to scrub floors with a toothbrush. Next, you're denied personal hygiene. Before you know it, you're on call 24 hours a day to perform tasks for members. You're sleep deprived. You're kidnapped under the guise of fun, blindfolded, paddled, beaten, forced alcohol until you pass out. When the hazing starts, it's something that just makes you feel a little awkward, then embarrassed. As it builds, you start to wonder, am I being oversensitive, overreacting? Then it goes beyond uncomfortable. You're not sure if this is hazing, but you start to wonder. You don't know whose fault it is because you've agreed to everything so far. Before you know it, you're in too deep. You're humiliated by your participation, so you just white-knuckled out because you know it's almost over. And what can you do about it anyhow? How are you going to report? You don't have any proof. You don't have enough evidence. If you push back and refuse the hazing, you know the retribution will be extreme. If you walk out, you're a coward, and you just lost your social connection. You're completely isolated. So you're shamed into staying, and you're shamed into keeping quiet. That's how hazing progresses, from embarrassing to humiliating to degrading to dangerous, and sometimes deadly. It's been 2 years since I received that knock at my door Since then, I have vowed to do everything I can to prevent another family from experiencing the pain and loss my family has experienced. I know that is going to take more than educating people about hazing. I know that is going to take courage. Courage on the part of students to speak up and report hazing to their organization's leadership, to school administration, to campus and school security, and when there's immediate danger, to call 911 without any hesitation. There was a 12-minute delay before 911 was called for Colin. Otherwise, he could be here today. It is going to call for courage on the part of all faculty sponsors, administrators, and coaches to have zero tolerance for hazing, because using embarrassment and shame and ridicule as the gateway to group membership is the path that leads to the use of pain, abuse, and assault. It's going to take courage on the part of university officials to mandate that organizations provide their members with anti-hazing education prior to recruiting any new members, and that prospective members complete anti-hazing education prior to participating in any type of recruitment process. It's going to take courage on the part of more legislators to increase penalties for hazing so law enforcement and legal authorities can treat hazing allegations as seriously as other crimes like domestic violence that use emotional manipulation to keep their victims silent and uses the appearance of consent to keep outsiders from interfering. And last, it's going to take courage from all of us to ask the uncomfortable questions of those groups when we suspect hazing's taken place. Before Colin left for college, I actually talked to him about hazing, even though at the time he wasn't planning on joining a fraternity. If I could go back to that conversation, I would want him to know that hazing builds so slowly, you're unaware it's even happening. I would want him to know that when new members are separated out from existing members and asked to do things differently in a way that you wouldn't otherwise choose, that's the minute hazing's begun. That's the minute you leave.